Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. We are going to explore the second part of Annie Bezant's book, Thought Power. We had a previous series to this in which we studied the metaphysical foundations of the subject. We looked into the nature of the mind, how the mind works, etc. And now in this second part, we are going to explore the practical aspect of the teachings, which involve the idea of making of our minds a useful instrument, not only for our own evolution, but also to help humanity, to help in the evolution of humanity too. In our previous series, the main concept that you have to keep in mind when we explore now this practical aspect is that our minds have a power that affects us. The way we think affects us. The way we think affects other people too by means of thought forms, and also affects the environment. We will see by the end of this series some ways in which we can use the power of thought to help other people. And Annie Bezant said that one basic need for our minds to have a real possibility of producing effects in the sense of being able to help others or to accelerate our own evolution is the ability to think in a clear way, to be able to follow a line of thinking without getting distracted, to be able to produce definite thoughts. All of these things produce thought forms that are lasting, so we can send our good wishes to people or places or situations, and those thought forms can become influences for good, and we will see that toward the end of the series. But also for our own evolution, when we train the mind to have a clear thinking, then the mind may become an instrument of the higher nature. And what we are going to see in this second series is perhaps the main way to train our minds, that is by means of meditation. Meditation is basically the training ground for not only our minds, but also our emotional aspect and also our spiritual nature. But in this particular book, Annie Bezant focuses on the mental aspect. And she will show how, by means of the practice of meditation, our mind may become a vehicle of the higher nature. So the first step in this process of meditation is one of concentration. In the theosophical tradition, there are 3 stages in meditation, which is concentration first, then meditation, properly speaking, that is the applying of a particular technique, and then contemplation, in which we leave behind all mental activity so that the mind can be quiet and open to receive the inspiration from the higher nature or to raise our consciousness to the higher nature. In most traditions, the first step, they agree that the first step is concentration. In Hindu yoga, it's called dharana, for example. In Buddhism, in the Theravada tradition, is called samatha, for example. So we will see how Annie Bezant presents the subject, what kind of practice she recommends, and the effects of this practice. So let us start. Annie Bezant says, few things more tax the powers of the student who is beginning to train his mind than concentration. In the early stages of the activity of the mind, at the beginning of evolution, progress depends on its swift movements, on its alertness, on its readiness to receive impacts from sensation after sensation, turning its attention quickly from one to the other. So the theosophical view is an evolutionary view. And when we start working on spiritual practices, something that we discover soon is how difficult it is to train our minds. And one may wonder why. Theosophical tradition proposes that the mind is restless, the mind is always seeking to be on the move, because this was what the mind needed to do in the first part of evolution. As Annie Besant says here, the mind, when it begins its evolution in the human kingdom of nature, the mind is quite asleep, is not very able to respond to the environment, perhaps as we see in a baby, for example. As we discussed in the previous series, the development of a child as he or she grows represents the developments that we as humanity went through. So you see at the beginning, the baby tends to fall unconscious often and only wake up when there are strong sensations from outside, whether hunger or a pain or something like that. And little by little, the mind begins to engage with the external world and to awaken. So in all the first part of human evolution, what it is needed is that the mind becomes, as Annie Besant says there, becomes active, responds to every stimuli that comes from outside, is constantly trying to connect sensations, all the what we would call a very active mind. And that's part of what was correct, what was desirable at that stage of evolution. Now, people who are interested seriously in the spiritual practice, they are at a turning point in evolution where all the energies that were going out, so to say, in the first part, now they have to be turned around so that we can explore the inner aspect of life and ourselves. And in that transition, there is an inertia that the mind, the emotions, even the body has toward sensation, toward activity. So that transition, that between going out and then turn the tide to go in, is not an easy transition. For this reason, you see again in many scriptures, especially in the East, you see the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna tells Arjuna that the mind, or Arjuna tells Krishna, how can you control the mind? The mind is as difficult to control as the wind, or in the Dhammapada, in the Buddhist tradition, again, it is said that the mind is really hard to control, that it just moves like a fish out of the water. And so there is a universal recognition that controlling the mind is not easy. And this is important to keep in mind, because when we begin to try to apply these teachings and try to practice this, many times aspirants are shocked to see how difficult it is to quiet the mind. And they think that there is something wrong with them, or that the technique doesn't work. What we need to understand from the very beginning is that this difficulty is universal, and it has been for millennia a problem that anybody interested in the spiritual life has to face. So Annie Besant continues that in this first part of evolution, while the mind is collecting materials for thought, extreme mobility is an advantage. And for many, many lives, the mind grows through this mobility and increases it by exercise. So now, the stoppage of this habit of running outwards in every direction the imposition of a fixed attention on a single point, this change naturally comes with a jar and a shock, and the mind plunges wildly like an unbroken horse when it first feels the bit. And this is, I think, also an experience of many people, that they say, my mind is okay, but the moment that I sit and I try to quiet it, then it seems that it gets more restless than ever. It just reacts. And there is some truth there. Again, in the theosophical tradition, every aspect of our being has a consciousness of its own. We are not the mind. We are, let's say, the soul. And the mind is an instrument that we are using to express ourselves by means of thinking, what we call thinking, for example. We saw this in the previous series. The idea is that the mind itself is a kind of life. And as a life, it has a kind of consciousness of its own habits, its own reactions. So just like you see with animals, well, Annie Besant is giving here the example of an animal, a horse. When the horse is not tamed and somebody tries to tame him or her, then you see a reaction from the horse. Or with any animals, when you try to make the animal do something, there is an instinctive reaction to try to avoid doing that until the animal is trained or gets, confident with the person. So our minds react in a similar way. The moment you start to try to make the mind be fixed on one particular object of concentration, there is a reaction there. And you have to be ready for that. And, as anything else, in time, that reaction begins to wane and not to be so strong. Although training the mind to concentrate takes some time. It's not something that you will gain in a few weeks unless you've done this for many lifetimes. We always have to keep in mind that we have a long past behind us. So then Annie Besant quotes Patanjali, who is one of the fathers of yoga. Yoga, not so much as exercises and asanas, but yoga as a spiritual life in which meditation is central. So Patanjali speaks of stopping the modifications of the thinking principle of the mind. And Annie Besant says there are two aspects to doing this. There are two aspects to concentration. Again, in the previous series, we saw that a human being is composed, let's say, or consists of two main aspects, one that belongs to matter and one that belongs to spirit. The one that belongs to matter has to do with our bodies, physical body or mental body, the different vehicles of consciousness. And all these things are material. The mental body, even though it is not physical matter as the one we see through our senses, with our senses, it is material, but a kind of matter that is beyond the perception of our physical senses. So there is an aspect of us that is material. And because it is material, there is some inertia there. There is the matter always falls into habits or into patterns, etc. And then there is the other aspect of us, that is the spirit, the aspect of consciousness. So consciousness and body, spirit and mind, they are always working together. And when we talk about anything, evolution or the spiritual work, etc., we have to keep in mind both aspects. So here in concentration, we again have these two aspects. Many times, Annie Besant calls the aspect of matter the form aspect, because matter is always shaped into a particular form to serve as a vehicle of consciousness. And then Annie Besant explained earlier in the book that the know and that consciousness working through the mind is the knower in us, not the process of thinking per se. Consciousness is that awareness that can know, not so much as incorporating information, which is also part of it, but know in the sense of it's the one that perceives, the one that knows there is something out there, knows there is something happening inside of us. It's that awareness that perceives. So she says concentration has to deal with these two aspects. On the form side, stopping the ever-changing modifications of the mental body, keeping it shaped to one steady image. Again, in the previous series, we saw that the mental body, which is part of what we may call the aura, is always moving. If you are clairvoyant and you can see the mental body, you see that there are images constantly coming and going on the mental body. Some of the images are coming from outside by means of thought forms, for example. A thought forms comes, touches the mental body, and reproduces its image in our mental body. And some other images are really coming from inside. The mental body is reproducing images out of memory, let's say. So this is what psychologically we experience as this constant thinking that happens in our minds. Again, Annie Besant said in the previous part of the book that there are two kinds of thinking. True thinking, that is the one in which you are willingly thinking, reasoning, examining. And then there is this other mechanical thinking, that is when all these thoughts are going through our minds and we are not even paying attention to them. That she says that's not true thinking, that's simply the mental body that is constantly reproducing these images that we experience as thoughts. So for concentration, one thing we need to do is to be able to stop that constant movement of the mental body. Again, as she explained, the mental body is used to be constantly producing images. So we have to retrain the mental body to be quiet. We have to, in a sense, tame the mental body so that it can stop producing all this automatic movement. And then there is concentration also has to do with the consciousness aspect on the knower side, that is the directing the attention steadily to the particular form that we are trying to reproduce in concentration, so as to reproduce it perfectly within itself. So what the mental body has to do is to stop producing images. And then what consciousness has to learn to do is to, when we are focusing on a mental image, or, we will see different objects of concentration later today, but when we are focusing on something that we are conceiving, we as consciousness need to learn to stay there, not to be distracted, not to, lose interest and then start thinking of something else. So both things are necessary in learning concentration. From the practical point of view, at the beginning it's difficult to separate, what belongs to the mental body, what belongs to me as consciousness. But with practice, you start noticing anything that is unwilling, anything that is automatic, that happens without your conscious participation, has to do with the mental body. And everything that has to do, or that involves your intention, your will, your active action, that has to do with your consciousness. We normally are not trained to pay attention for a steady amount of time, to something. We are trained to be constantly shifting our attention, and also our mental body is trained to be constantly changing too. This is why it is difficult to learn to concentrate the mind. Now, concentration is very important because from an esoteric point of view, when we contemplate an idea, we are not merely contemplating something that we are making up. You know, if you meditate on a virtue, let's say on peace, at the beginning, if you start thinking of peace, you will think of whatever your concepts of peace are. But peace, when you think of peace, peace is a reality on the inner planes. When you think of peace, what happens is that you start connecting to that principle, to that universal principle that we may call peace. And if you concentrate on that steadily, then you have the possibility to start seeing, to start understanding, to start perceiving aspects of peace, of the this thing that we call peace, that were not part of your minds, that were not part of your knowledge. These are new insights. And the reason is that what you are contemplating is not just your idea of peace. We start contemplating our idea of peace. But then as you focus your mind, you start contemplating the true idea of peace. And if you look steadily, you have the possibility of seeing there are things that you had never noticed before. And this is what Annie Besant says here. As fixing the eye steadily on an object enables us to observe its details unnoticed in a hasty glance, so does concentration enable us to observe the details of an idea. You see, even with physical objects, when you see something that you already know, normally we are seeing our own idea of that. So this is why we may be living in a place that is beautiful, and then in time we stop seeing the beauty and we see just the memory of the place, and it doesn't strike us as beautiful any longer, for example. That's because we are not really seeing the object, we are seeing a memory, and we have seen that memory many times. Now, an exercise, for example, next time you go for a walk or drive somewhere that you normally do, you may think that you know the place you are going, etc. But if you pay attention, if you try to be really aware, you discover that this place had many more things that you had never noticed. The things were there, but you never noticed because as you go to that place, you are really seeing your own image of the place, not the place itself. So similarly with the ideas, we have this idea of peace, for example, and at the beginning, when we concentrate on it, we only see our image of peace. But if we can pay attention steadily, we start seeing all the other things that belong to the universal idea of peace that we never saw before. And that's the value of concentration and meditation, that we can have a deeper insight into whatever we meditate on than otherwise we could if we just play with our thoughts in the way that we normally do, without examining something in a deeper way. So Annie Besant continues, when the mind is thus kept shaped to one image and the knower steadily contemplates it, he obtains a far fuller knowledge of the object than he could obtain by means of any verbal description of it. In our previous series, we saw that when we are thinking of something, our mind shapes itself to the image of that which we are thinking. Even when we are perceiving something, we are not perceiving what is out there. We are perceiving the reflection of that image on our mental body. There is a part of the mental body that is shaped to reproduce the object that we are perceiving. And we as consciousness see the reproduction in the mental body. We explored this in the previous series. So this is why Annie Besant says here that when the mind is kept in this shape of the one image. For example, if we are talking about peace, or it can be about something more concrete, as we are going to see. If we can keep the mind shaped like that, then we as awareness can observe that shape, and that shape is reflecting the real principles out there. And then we can discover much more about what we are meditating on. And she finishes this part, and as we increase the intensity of the concentration, we take in more. So even for example, if you see the description that Einstein gives when he, had these revolutionary ideas, he says, it's not that I discovered these laws, for example, necessarily by going thinking sequentially and logically and then arriving at a conclusion. I would think very intensely, very steadily, about something very logically, but then something happened that a whole image would be presented to me, and there is like a leap, and then you understand. That leap that he's talking about is when our consciousness, because he had the ability to contemplate steadily whatever thing he was thinking about, that leap is when consciousness sees the real object that is behind the thinking. Because our thinking can, as I explained, can connect to the real object. He was, for example, meditating on certain laws of physics, and what begins as mere thinking, if done in this way, you start seeing the thing that you are thinking about, and you can have a direct perception of that, and that is information that comes to you that was never in your thought, that is out there, but this is an ability that the mind has to connect to realities out there. So we will see a little more about that as we proceed, but this is why Annie Besant says, as we increase the intensity of the concentration, we can take in more, because we are beginning to see the real object. So regarding steps in concentration, Annie Besant says at the beginning there are two difficulties that have to be overcome. First, the knower, our consciousness working through the mind, must disregard the impressions continually being thrown on the mind, and the mental body must be prevented from answering to these contacts. In yoga, this is called pratyahara. Pratyahara is like, sometimes it's translated as abstraction of the senses. The basic idea here is, when you are meditating, your ears are still perceiving, your body is still perceiving sensations. If you meditate with your eyes open, your eyes are seeing, your nose is perceiving smells. So there are all these impressions that are coming from outside and are impressing the mental body. So the mental body is constantly being shaped by impressions that come from outside. Remember that I mentioned when something comes through the senses, it hits the mental body, and the mental body is shaped to reproduce that sensory perception, and then our consciousness sees that image that was formed on the mental body. So the first step in concentration is to learn to make our mental body not to respond to the environment. When you are daydreaming, you are doing that basically. When you are abstracted in thought, you are doing that. Somebody may be talking to you and you are not perceiving it. The mental body is not being affected, it's not being shaped by what you are perceiving, because your mind is busy doing something else. So the first step is this one of pratyahara, or the ability to abstract your attention from from the external world, so that the mental body is not constantly being changed or shaped by external stimuli. And then second, the mind must not only refuse to modify itself in response to the impacts from without, but it must also cease its own inner activity, wherewith it is constantly rearranging its contents. Remember that we said part of thinking is like working with the images from memory and constantly running those images, in front of us as consciousness. That is a lot of the thinking that happens in us. Is just this constant rerunning of previous images. And Bezanт says, not only you have to stop the mental body from reproducing external impulses or stimuli, you have to learn, you as consciousness, to stop rerunning all these images or thoughts. All these images are basically thoughts. She continues, the mind itself then must hold for the time the object of concentration as the sole image. And this is what is called in yoga dharana, which is usually translated as concentration. So in simpler words, what we need to do is to learn how not to respond to the environment and how to pay attention, not to respond to inner distractions, for example. When you are daydreaming, you are abstracted, you are in a kind of pratyahara, but you are distracted inwardly. You are thinking about something that you many times are not even aware that you are thinking of. In meditation, this happens many times. If you get caught in a trend of thinking that is not what you are trying to do, you may be perfectly abstracted from whatever is going on outside. You stopped hearing the ticking of the clock, but you are still not concentrated because you are distracted inwardly. You may want to concentrate your mind on something, and then a different trend of thinking comes and your awareness is dragged into that particular line of thinking. So concentration implies these two things. Stop paying attention to the outside and learn to pay attention inwardly to what we choose and not being moved by internal distractions. So Bezanт clarifies, when there is concentration, the mind does not, of course, sees the totality of its activity, but sends it all along a single channel. So in concentration, it's not that you stop working mentally, it's just that you gather all the mental activity and you focus it on one particular object of concentration, which can be an idea, can be an image, can be a state of consciousness. We'll see there are different objects of concentration. And this is actually one of the meanings of yoga. One of the meanings of yoga is to gather, to bring together. And we can interpret that yoga means to bring all the activity of the mind, all the powers of the mind, and focus them on one particular object of concentration. And this is like what happens with a river. A river that is wide, if you all of a sudden make it narrower, then the water begins to run with far more speed, with far more force. So similarly, the powers of our minds that are constantly dispersed in many different activities and motions, many of which are they contradict each other. When you gather all that in one direction, then that attention generates a lot of power. And this is why concentration is so important, both to produce effects outside to help other people, and it's also very powerful to produce effects in our own nature, as we will see. Now, when we start practicing concentration, unless we have been practicing concentration for many incarnations, there is always a certain, there is an experience, and even if we have been practicing concentration for, many lifetimes, in each lifetime, you have to tame the mind again. So it's like, you may be a great horse rider and you know how to do these things, but if you get a new horse, you will have to apply effort, and it will be difficult even if you have done it many times in the past. That doesn't mean that you will, ride on a new horse, an unbroken horse, as it is sometimes called, and that all of a sudden, because you did it many times in the past, the horse says, okay, I will acquiesce. There will be a struggle there until this new horse is tamed. So similarly, even if we have done it many times in the past, we have to struggle with this mind. Now, if we have done it in the past, there is a whole experience that is there. So results may be shown faster, but there is always a certain level of struggle. And Bezanт says here that when you are trying to concentrate, your attention is divided between two aspects of the process. One, you are focusing on whatever you choose to meditate on. But there is a part of your mind that has to be constantly, let's say, struggling against the tendency to get distracted. So until your mind acquiesces, in a sense, and gets used to being naturally quiet in the process of contemplation, there is this double work that you are doing, trying to keep focused and at the same time trying to rein in the mind so that it doesn't go off the object of concentration. So she says, this effort necessitates the partial direction of the attention to resisting distractions. And when the tendency to respond to them has been overcome, the effort to resist itself must pass. This is important because, as Bezanт will say, true concentration is the one that is effortless. True concentration is a deep relaxation, in a sense. True concentration is has to do with letting go of the tendency to move here and there. So once the mind is tamed to some extent, concentration is restful. But before we get to that point, there is an inevitable period where effort is necessary, as long as the mental body has its own inertia and tendency to be constantly reproducing different images. As long as that happens, because the mental body materially has an inertia, as I mentioned at the beginning, as long as this inertia is there, you have to apply a certain level of energy to keep the mental body from moving. So until that happens, concentration requires energy. Concentration requires effort. And, meditation may be experienced not if you do meditation in the way that Bezanт will present it, which is it has a very transcendental aim. You can come to meditation for many reasons. You may come to meditation to develop certain positive emotions, so you think about nice things, beautiful things, positive things, and then you feel good, and that's perfectly fine. Or you can come to meditation just to rest and let your mind do whatever the mind wants, and you just rest. Or you can come to meditation, for different purposes, and they all have their own value. But the kind of meditation that Annie Besant will present here, that is the one that can accelerate your mental evolution, is one where you come to meditation to do a certain specific work. You don't come to meditation just to feel good. You don't come to meditation to feel relaxed. Again, there is nothing wrong with that, but you can also feel good by sitting in nature and contemplate nature. And you can relax, again, by just resting in nature and feeling the life of nature around you. You don't need necessarily meditation for that, although it is a form of meditation. But the kind of meditation that Annie Besant proposes here is what in early theosophical tradition was explained as occult work. Occult means hidden, and this has to do with working with the unseen aspect of our nature, the higher nature. So in this work, as in any work, you need to put some effort until you get to that point in which the mental body has been reshaped, has been tamed, and then the effort is not necessary any longer in that direction. Then the effort is mainly in trying to raise your consciousness. So Annie Besant says, eventually, when the tendency of the mental body to respond to the environment is overcome, then the effort must cease. And she continues, for the true deep concentration, perfect balance is needed. Neither resistance nor non-resistance. Neither, making an effort to hold the mind concentrated, nor just letting yourself go with the mind. But a steady quietude, so strong, the poise itself is so strong that waves from outside will not produce any result, not even the secondary result of the consciousness of something to be resisted. So when the poise becomes deep, stable on its own, then the mental body simply doesn't respond to things from outside, or our own consciousness is quiet, so that it's not reproducing things from inside. And that's when there is a true stable concentration that is effortless. So let's say we will see later, only when this kind of concentration is attained, we can move on to the next stage, and we will see that later. But now Annie Besant turns to some of the effects of this practice of concentration. So she says, to most people at the present stage of evolution, this inner world of thought represents the I. We think, I am these thoughts. The very attempt to still the mind soon brings about a step forward in the evolution of consciousness. For we quickly feel that the ruler and the ruled cannot be one, and instinctively identify ourselves with the ruler. In the expression, I quiet my mind, the mind is felt as a possession of the I. So the mind is not the I, it's not myself. And this is the first realization. This is, again, part of the experience of anybody that tries to meditate. When in the theosophical tradition we say that the mind has its own consciousness, its own tendencies, etc., many people are puzzled because they are used to thinking, I am the mind, so whatever the mind wants is what I want, whatever I want is what the mind wants. There is at this point in evolution, as Annie Besant says there is a strong identification with the mind. But it takes only, the attempt to sit down and quiet your mind for you to realize that your mind has a life of its own. If you are the mind, then surely you can stop thinking whenever you want to stop thinking. So you should be able to sit down and say, okay, now I think, now I don't think. And then the mind would be quiet. So this is not what really happens. So in this process, you begin to discover, wait a second, so who is the one that is constantly thinking that I cannot control? And who am I, the one that is trying to control this? There is obviously a difference there. And Annie Besant says this is the first realization that comes from the exercise of concentration, which is a very important one. At the beginning, it's a more superficial realization. Somehow we feel that there are two eyes within our minds, the eye that thinks and that I cannot control, and the eye that is trying to control. But eventually we realize that what we really are is actually beyond the mind. It's not within the realm of the mind. Of course, we are using the mind to express ourselves, but what we are is not the mind, it's not thought. It's a silent awareness that is beyond the mind. But this realization comes later with more practice, not only of meditation, but also other aspects of the spiritual life. However, this is very important, as Annie Besant says here, realizing that mind that I regarded to be myself for a long time, realizing that there is something else going on here, and that the mind tends to do things that I don't necessarily want to do. Because until I realize that, if the mind wants to do something, I assume this is what I want to do. But with the practice of concentration, more and more we start realizing, wait, the mind is having thoughts, or the mind and emotions are having desires, are trying to do this, or are taking this point of view that is not really what I want. I am being dragged into that direction by the mind. That realization of that inner duality is very important. It's what opens the door to attain self-mastery and to realize our true self. So Annie Besant says, as the practice goes on, the horizon widens out, but as though inwards, continually, illimitably, there unfolds a power of knowing truth at sight, which only shows itself when the lower mind, with its slow process of reasoning, is transcended. In Theosophy, the lower mind is the thinking mind. So as the practice goes on, Annie Besant says here, we begin to discover that there is another faculty in us that is seeing the truth directly. That is something that the powers of reasoning cannot bring. A more extreme example of this is what I explained from Einstein. This is exactly what Einstein says that he experienced, that he was able to see a truth that was not the natural outcome of the process of reasoning. So similarly, we begin to perceive certain truths that are not the outcome of reasoning. Truths as unity, or that our spiritual nature, that we are not just the body, the emotions and the mind. All these things they don't really belong to the lower mind, to the senses, because we cannot see any of this. But as the lower mind begins to be trained to be quiet, little by little, our consciousness can move beyond the lower mind to the higher nature that is the one that sees, directly. As long as the lower mind is restless, it's like we as consciousness are trapped within the lower mind and within the faculties of the lower mind. When we start learning to quiet that mind, then there is an opening for us to start perceiving from a higher perspective. And Annie Besant continues, as the mind assumes a more and more subordinate position, these powers of the ego, this is a technical term in Theosophy before modern psychology used the word ego in the way they do. Ego means I-ness, and it's the idea of the soul. So as the mind assumes a more and more subordinate position, these powers of the soul assert their own predominance, and intuition, which is analogous to direct vision on the physical plane, takes the place of reasoning, which may perhaps be compared to the physical plane sense of touch. On the physical plane, if you cannot see, you have to touch something all over the place so that you can form a mental image of what this may be. If you see, you don't need to go to that sequential touch in all the aspects so that you can form the image. You see directly and you see the whole thing. Similarly, intuition is an ability that is in us to see truth directly, complete the truth of whatever we are meditating on. And reasoning is more like a blind touch. Our reasoning has to start working on one aspect and then working on another aspect and then little by little it tries to build an idea of what that which you are thinking about is. And of course you can get to an idea, but that idea is always more imperfect than if you see the whole thing spiritually in this way, or in this case. So as the mind becomes more of an instrument for the higher nature, then this intuition, this spiritual intuition, begins to be more available to us, more accessible. Now, by intuition, we don't mean what most people think of intuition, like that is more like a feeling, an impulse, or something like that. And Bezanт says, this intuition is not impulse, which is born of desire, and which is lower, not higher than reasoning. So in the theosophical tradition, you have the mind and you have desire that is lower than the mind in the sense that it is something that we develop before we develop the mind in the process of evolution. And then you have something that is higher, that is intuition, that we develop after we have developed the mind. And that's the stage in which we are right now. So she says this kind of spiritual intuition is higher than the mind. The impulse and reaction, etc., of the desire is lower than the mind. And this is very important because in the modern spirituality, the two are many times confused. When we say that the mind brings you an illusion, that the mind, cannot perceive reality, sometimes that is interpreted as meaning, so give up the mind and just live in your emotions, be spontaneous, which means just go along with your emotional reactions, etc. But in that case, what you are doing is giving up the mind for something lower. What the theosophical tradition proposes is not giving up the mind, it's transcending the mind so that you can replace the mind for something higher. It's not that the mind doesn't work any longer and you don't need it. What Bezanт is meaning here is what is driving your perception? Is your perception driven by emotions? Is it driven by intellectual concepts? Or is it driven by this intuitive perception of truth? We know that, there is nothing wrong with emotions, but emotions are not able to see the larger picture. So a person that only acts from the emotion will do many foolish things that are counterproductive. Now, a person that is intellectual also that has a lot of limitations. And many times the person that is intellectual dismisses the emotions. What Bezanт is proposing here, there is a higher faculty, intuition, which can be the driver of our perceptions, and then the intuition will produce the right kind of thoughts and the right kind of emotions, but the perception is coming from the level of intuition, not from the level of the mind or the emotions. And this begins to happen little by little, very gradually. You may not even notice it, in a very conscious way, but it happens as we begin to practice meditation and other aspects of the spiritual life too. And then we have objectless concentration. So this is the next step. And Bezanт says, when the mind is well trained in concentrating on an object and can maintain its one-pointedness, as this state is called, for some little time, the next stage is to drop the object and to maintain the mind in this attitude of fixed attention without the attention being directed to anything. So remember, we said when you get to that point where you can concentrate your mind with no effort, when there is this steady, spontaneous, focused attention, then you are ready to try the next thing. That is, drop your concentration on something in particular and stay in a state of pure, silent, quiet attention with no form reproduced in front of you, on the mental body. Just stay in pure silence and darkness. She says, in this state, the mental body shows no image because you are not, if you are clairvoyant and you look at a person that is concentrating perfectly, you see that the mental body is quiet and there is only one image that is the object of concentration on the mental body. Now that object is dropped so that the mental body becomes like a perfect mirror. There is no distortion there. There is no image. So in this state, the mental body shows no image. Its own material is there, held steady and firm, receiving no impressions, in a condition of perfect calm, like a waveless lake, like this perfect mirror that I talked about, that I mentioned. So it is in this perfect lake that the moon can be perfectly reflected. If there are ripples in the lake, the reflection of the moon is distorted. So when the mind is perfectly still, it can become a mirror of who we really are, of our higher nature. So realization of our true nature begins when we can see ourselves as consciousness reflected in the still mind. When in meditation, the mind is completely still, we can see a reflection of our true nature, for example. But when this objectless concentration is done in the context of first having been concentrated on an object, what happens, as Annie Besant will say, is that we gain the ability to see that object on a higher plane. So she says, first she says, this is not a state which can last for more than a very brief period. The state of no motion at all, of nothing, no concentrating on anything, but staying in quiet, dark silence, is always brief. Either you go through it and a higher perception comes, or you come back to the movement of the mind. The consciousness, as the mental body is stilled, escapes from it and passes into and out of what in Hinduism is called the Laya center, the neutral points of contact between the mental body and the causal body. So the causal body is a higher body, that is the body of the soul, let's say. So when the mental body is still, you can get through the mental body and begin to perceive on the causal body, that is perceiving at the level of the soul. Or if you can do that, then you come back to the perception of the mental body. It requires, in general, a long time of practice until the inertia of consciousness to come back to the mind is overcome, so that consciousness will go through to a higher perception. So Annie Besant says that when this happens, this passage, is accompanied by a momentary swoon, a loss of consciousness, which is the inevitable result of the disappearance of objects of consciousness, and is followed by consciousness in the higher body. So for a brief period of time, there is like a loss of consciousness, and immediately there is a higher consciousness that appears there. This is not the same as falling into a trance where you remain unconscious for, half an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. The methods proposed in the Theosophical tradition are, they don't encourage to fall into these unconscious trances. This is just a transition, and then awareness is regained. Again, this is a stage that is beyond the experience of most people. Annie Besant is just laying the ground so that you see what is coming. What we need to practice is to practice concentration, to perfect it, and eventually, we will get here. Then the ego, the soul, can shape the mental body according to his own lofty thoughts and permeate it with his own vibrations. So as consciousness learns to raise itself to the mental body, then there is like a communication between the lower thinking mind and the higher mind that belongs to the soul. And the soul can impress more and more its own wisdom, a wisdom that is inherent in the soul, can be impressed in the mind. And the person becomes what we call a sage, a wise person. The soul can mold it after the high visions of the planes beyond his own, that he has caught a glimpse of in his own highest moments, and can thus convey downwards and outwards ideas to which the mental body, which is the thinking mind, would otherwise be unable to respond. These are inspirations of genius that flash down in the mind with dazzling light. So this is, generates a connection with our spiritual nature, and now the spiritual perceptions are available for our thinking mind. All right, and then the last session for today, we will go quickly through this because we will discuss this later more. How to concentrate. Bezant says the student should therefore begin the practice of concentration. If that person, he or she, in the 19th century, early 20th, the male gender was used for both. Today we would write it in a different way. So she says, if he be of a devotional temperament, his work will be much simplified, for then he can take the object of his devotion as the object of contemplation, and the heart being powerfully attracted to that object, the mind will readily dwell on it, presenting the beloved image without effort and excluding others with equal ease. So if a person has a devotional nature or is a devotee of some spiritual, person or ideal, then that helps a lot in meditation, because concentration on that which we love, that we are devoted of, is far easier than trying to concentrate the mind on something that is not very attractive to us. So devotion always helps. If it is, again, all qualities have their own difficulties, and a devotion that is not mature is often very unsteady, very, it's a victim of the cycles of emotions. But a devotional disposition helps to focus the mind and to concentrate it, because we are attracted to that. Unfortunately, in the world today, spiritual devotion is not really encouraged. I always mention that, our heroes are either sport people or business people who are wealthy or successful, or actors, what people follow are these kind of examples. We don't have religious heroes. We don't have, a sense of admiration and many spiritual models out there. So unfortunately, for most people, devotion to a spiritual personality or ideal is not very common today, and that is a loss. She says if a person has a certain devotion, let's say she explains, if that person is Christian, it could be Jesus or the Virgin Mother, or if the person is Hindu, it can be Vishnu, Krishna, or the Buddha for a Buddhist, etc. It doesn't matter who the object of devotion is, as long as that object of devotion generates in you the sense of spiritual devotion and love. That person will think of the object of his devotion, creating by the imagination as clearly as he can a picture, an image of that object, and he will then keep his mind fixed on that image, on the thought of the beloved. So in this technique, if you use a spiritual personality, you visualize, you close your eyes and you visualize the object of devotion. Whatever of these examples, or in the theosophical tradition, it would be a master of the wisdom, etc. And then you fix your mind there as if you were watching a portrait of the person. So concentration implies visualizing the object of devotion and fixing your mind there and keeping your mind steadily contemplating that image as you would if you had your eyes open and you were contemplating a portrait, for example. Now, if the temperament of the person is not devotional, then the element of attraction may be used as a help, but in this case, it will bind to an idea, not to a person. So if you don't have that devotional character, or you are not devoted to some spiritual personality, then you can meditate on ideals, something that inspires you, something that you love, something that you are attracted to. So she says the earliest attempts at concentration should always be made with the help of something that you are attracted to. Here, the attractive image will take the form of some profound idea, some high problem of the spiritual life that you want, that you feel that you need to solve. You have to find what's the right object of concentration for you. Such should form the object of concentration. And on that, the mind should be steadily bent. Here, the binding power of attraction would be intellectual interest, the deep desire for knowledge. Another very fruitful form of concentration is to choose a virtue and concentrate upon that. The virtue should be imaged by the mind in the completest possible way, and when a general view of its effects has been obtained, the mind should be steadied on its essential nature. So if you are meditating on peace or love or this or that, you are trying to understand what's the essence of that. What is common in the love of a mother, the love of a friend, the love for humanity, the love of a partner? And what is it in all these manifestations that is common? What is the essence? Maybe you begin to feel that the essence is a willing to give, or to unite, or to make, to produce happiness. And little by little, you start perceiving the essence of what love is. And as you do that, your mind begins to focus more and more on the essential meaning of love. And then when you get the sense that this is what love essentially is, you stop there and you hold that feeling, you hold that realization, and you contemplate it in silence. And that would be using, for example, a virtue, love, peace, tolerance, whatever it is, as an object of concentration. Now, Bezanт says this method has an additional benefit, a great subsidiary advantage of this kind of concentration is that the mind shapes itself to the virtue and repeats its vibrations. The virtue will gradually become part of the nature and will be firmly established in the character. There is this maxim, we become that we think of, we meditate on. So in meditating on a virtue, we shape our mental and emotional bodies in the form of the virtue. Remember that when we think of something, we are shaping our mental body in that form. So we are actually making our mental and emotional bodies in the likeness of the virtue that we are meditating on. And then she says, when you are trying to concentrate, when the mind loses hold of its object, as it will time after time, because the experience is that you will be trying to concentrate, and then you discover that you are not, thinking or contemplating that any longer. This will happen time after time, not once, not twice. This will be your experience in concentration. If you are starting, it will be your experience for some time. Then when that happens, the mind must be brought back and again directed to the object. Often, at first, it will wander away without the wandering being noticed. You may have been thinking of something else for 5 minutes before you realize that you are distracted. And the student suddenly awakes to the fact that he's thinking about something quite other than the proper object of thought. This will happen again and again, and the student must patiently bring the mind back, a wearisome and tiring process, but there is no other way by which concentration can be gained. So, you have to be humble. This will happen. Don't get frustrated. Gently, you bring your mind to the object of concentration time and again and again. And in that process of letting go and bringing it back, you build the ability to concentrate. It's like the muscles, to develop a muscle, you put a weight and you let go, and then in bringing it back, you generate muscle. So every time you are bringing back your mind to the object of concentration, you are generating that muscle, which eventually will allow you to concentrate. And the last thing, she says, it is a useful and instructive mental exercise when the mind has thus slipped away without notice, to take it back again by the road along which it traveled in its trains. So you wake up to the fact that you are making the grocery list. So how did you get there from being concentrating on love, for example? Try to trace back, okay, what did I think before making the grocery shopping list? Then you may have been thinking about a person that you met at the grocery shop yesterday, and you were thinking about that person because you had seen that person was very loving, with her children, and you were thinking about that because you were meditating on love. So if you can retrace the chain of associations that the mind produces, that it's first, it brings self-knowledge. It is interesting to see how the mind works, but also it is beneficial to learn to perceive when the mind begins to do this. Then you realize it right away and you can keep the mind focused. So this is why Besant says this process increases the control of the rider over his runaway horse and thus diminishes its inclination to escape. All right, so that's all the presentation for today. Now we can go to the question and answers. We went a little beyond time because I had to do an introduction, but we will try to keep half an hour, 25 minutes for question and answers and comments. So I see one here, I have you have there a question and answer window. You can type there and I will read it and then I'll comment on this. So concentrating mental energy into a single channel makes a lot of sense to me, but with a river analogy, it is the only way to fill the channel with more water and thus have more concentrated energy. To practice these techniques in our current lives and whatever determines if we searched the occult in previous lives, let me see, yes. So whether we can, the ability we have to gather all these energies, I would say first, there is, and inexhaustible source of energy within us, because our true self is the source of energy, the source of life in the cosmos, really, because our true self is the universal self. But that source of energy is not, that infinite source of energy is not available on all the planes. We know on the physical plane, we have a certain degree of energy, and when we exhaust that energy, we have to rest, we have to eat, we have to maintain the physical body and the physical energy. Now, there is more energy at the emotional level, there is even more energy at the mental level. Now, because of the process of meditation, we start aligning, let's say, all the different aspects of our being, we start having access to more and more energy. So as we learn to meditate, it's like more water begins to be available, as you say here, to fill that channel. Now, if we are inclined to practice these kinds of techniques in this lifetime, it's because we have had an interest before. Normally, the interest in these things builds up very slowly. It begins with a very passing interest, maybe for a few months and never again think of that, or in another incarnation a little longer. But if we are interested in this and we are willing to practice, etc., that means that we have been working in this direction in previous incarnations. To what extent, we don't know, and it doesn't really matter. We are wherever we are, and our duty, let's say, is to take the next step that from wherever we are. So you take what you got in this incarnation and you work with that. So it doesn't matter if you become able to focus your mind after 10 years of practicing, or after 3, or you have been meditating for 30 years and still you are struggling. It doesn't really matter, because you are doing what is necessary to be done, and things will move forward. Without you can trust the laws of the universe that things will move forward. All you have to do is to do the best you can today and leave the result to nature. Nature will take care of that. Good. Then next one. Should one pick a fresh idea to concentrate on each day and choose whatever is inspiring you at the time? Yeah, well, I would say it depends on what you are trying to do. If you are trying to just practice concentration, to learn to focus your mind, then I suppose it's fine. You can use different things to concentrate your mind on. If today you feel attracted to something, then you can meditate on that. Tomorrow you may be attracted to something else. Annie Besant doesn't mention here, but it's important to know that the kind of insights that will come through the practice of meditation depend on the object of meditation. For example, Einstein was meditating on a physical law, and he got an insight about physical laws. He developed the theory of relativity. If he had been meditating in that way on a spiritual subject, then the insight would have been about spiritual subjects or the spiritual nature. So the object of meditation is important in that the insight will depend on what you are, in this case, concentrating on. Later on we'll see meditation itself. So you can pick any object. And again, here, if you say, first, I just need to develop the ability of my mind to concentrate, you could take anything. You could concentrate on a flower, on a piece of, a crystal, on whatever you want, because this is actually training your mind to be focused. Sometimes at the beginning, it's easier if you do it with a very concrete element, It's easier to concentrate on that than something that you are visualizing. So it's perfectly fine. But when concentration begins to be used more as inner work, then it's better to stick to the object of concentration, because you, as I said, you can actually touch the reality of what you are meditating on. So you may be focusing your mind on these virtues or on a spiritual, a divine character or things like that, by which you can actually establish a kind of link. You can actually, spiritually touch that, and you can be affected by that. So when concentration is part of an occult work that you are doing, it's better to choose some object of concentration and then work steadily with that object for a while. And so, it depends on at what stage you are at this point and what you are trying to do. In other writings, Bezanт says we should practice concentration. Actually, she said it in this book, we saw it in the first part of this webinar. You should practice concentration in everything you do during the day. The day should be your training ground to focus your mind. So you do the dishes, do it concentrating your mind there instead of being daydreaming or letting the mind think of anything else. If you are walking your dog, walk mindfully with awareness. So in this way, you are not limiting the practice of meditation to, whenever you sit and try to focus your mind. You are using your daily life to practice concentration. And then as your mind learns to do this, then in meditation, you can use it to raise your consciousness, to have a spiritual insight. So again, Blavatsky would tell people that she was training, bring with you a crystal or a pebble in your pocket, and whenever you have a break, instead of complaining about this or thinking ill about that person, just pull that crystal and focus your mind there for a few minutes. So all that is very useful. And see where you are at, what aspect of the practice you are trying to develop, and then you can choose, how to do it. Okay, so I didn't concentrate on the course description enough to realize we are covering the last 4 chapters of the thought power and barely made it to the chapter covered here. Are the first sessions of the book available to view? We are, working on making them available. We have to see if we can get them ready. Eventually, they will be available, so we will let you know. The way, they are connected, but I try to make them independent also, so that if you didn't see the previous ones, you still can profit from this second part. But the whole subject is interesting. So yeah, that definitely would be something that would be beneficial. All right, anything else? I don't know if there is anything on the chat box or all the questions are being passed to the question and answer. Let me check. So there is a question if you need to read the book before, on which the class is based on. Well, as you saw, I bring excerpts from the book to explain, elaborate on them. My idea with these courses is to give you enough background so that you then can go to the book and read the book and understand it. It is a deep book, and there is a lot there. There are things that I cannot cover. I try to choose, what seems more relevant for me to cover. But ideally, you can go then and read the book. So you can do it however you want. You can read the book before the class and then see, my explanations about that, if they throw any other light. Or you could read it after you watch the class. You could read that chapter. Or you can read it also afterwards, study it. I have been reading every now and then this book. The first time I read this book was over 20 years ago. And every time I take this book, there is more than you can see. It's a deep book, so you can definitely always study this after the class. Is concentration the same as being present or the present moment? It is connected. To be present right now means to be aware, and there are different levels of awareness. There is an awareness in which you are not focusing on anything in particular. That awareness is like a very wide concentration. So concentration is like focusing on something in particular. So you restrict your attention from everything else and you focus on this particular thing. Awareness is like the opposite. Awareness, you open up your attention and you are present to whatever comes in view. So you are not sticking your attention to something in particular. What you are really concentrating on is the very fact of being aware. So many times when we talk about being present, what is meant is to concentrate on being aware. Aware of what? Aware of whatever happens, whatever is happening right now, instead of getting off track, in your thoughts and fears of the future or remembrances of the past. Many times being present is more difficult if your mind is not able to concentrate. It's difficult to remain present, because being present is a form of concentration, but it's a form of concentration where there is no object to support that concentration. So I would say, it's a higher form of concentration. I remember when I started practicing, awareness and all of this, I soon realized, how can I be aware or watch, my thoughts or be aware of what is going on if I can't keep my mind steadily focused on something, without being distracted. I remember I said, I sat in front of a tree and I saw that I couldn't keep my mind focused on the tree for more than a few seconds. So to me, it was obvious that unless I developed the ability to maintain my attention steady to something, it was going to be very difficult to be present, to be aware. So I started practicing concentration, in the way that Bezanт explains and other theosophical authors. And eventually, as I developed a certain ability to concentrate, then that can be applied to awareness, to being present, to have been this witnessing attitude of whatever thoughts, emotions, sensations come to us. Let me see, I'm going also through, okay. If your physical body is involved, such as chanting Om or staring at a candle, does that help or hinder the process? Are we better off just thinking of something? Well, one problem with the technique of staring at a candle is that it's very unhealthy. It's going to ruin your sight. In the East, yogis didn't really care about seeing properly or not. Actually, many of them regarded the senses as sources of distraction, so they didn't care if their senses would wane. But in the West, most of us cannot afford to lose the senses, because in the way that we live, we need them. So staring at a candle is physiologically not good, or staring at the sun. Also, if we stare at something with our eyes open, constantly, the problem is that we may fall into a kind of hypnosis. The physical senses, when there is a constant stimuli, your physical senses stop being able to perceive them. So if there is a smell that is constantly there, you don't smell it any longer after a while. If you leave your hand just resting on a surface, completely quiet. After a while, you don't feel the surface. If you stare at a flame, that constant stimulation begins to produce a paralysis of the optical nerve, and the optical nerve is directly connected to the brain. Actually, the eye is like a projection of the brain. So any visual stimulation that is constant affects the brain and can throw you into a state of hypnosis or trance. Now, in the theosophical tradition, that is something that you don't want to do. What we want to do is not to obliterate consciousness because we threw the physical body in a trance. We want to keep awareness and to raise that awareness to the higher planes. So the technique of watching something physically constantly with your eyes open is not the preferred technique in the theosophical tradition. So it's much better if you can reproduce things in your inner eye, let's say, because then you are not messing with the physical organs. Chanting the Om is fine, but again, Patanjali, the father of yoga, as many regard him, he would say, if you chant the Om, for this to be a real spiritual exercise, you have to chant the Om and meditate on its meaning. It's not just the chanting of the Om. Any mantra that you chant constantly, again, will tend to produce a kind of self-hypnosis, which may feel nice. The mind is quiet because you put the mind to sleep, basically. But you are not really learning, you as awareness, to go beyond the mind. You are just using some tricks to put the mind in a kind of torpor, so to say. So if you use the Om is a very powerful mantra, but use it to meditate on its meaning. The Om represents our true self. So you can do it like that. You can meditate on the Om or other important mantras in that way. Basically, to learn how to concentrate, it would be better if you work with images that you create. Chanting, you can chant also silently. In fact, any mantra when chanted silently is more powerful than when chanted, verbally. Those would be general principles. Are binaural beats and isochronic beats good for concentration? I have never really used any of those, aids. So I can tell you by experience. I know some people say they are useful. Some other people don't find them useful. I would say, try them and see if they help you. Again, always be, it's easy to confuse concentration and kind of falling asleep. In Buddhism, they always talk about the clarity of the mind. If your mind is quiet, but your awareness is clear, you are there, clear, present, that is true concentration. But if your mind, is quiet, but it's also kind of slumbering, then that is not true concentration. That is simply falling asleep in a way or in one way or the other. So if these sounds put you in that state of consciousness that is like dark, that is, you are not really present there, there is not that crisp awareness there, then don't use that method. So try it and see where it takes you. Okay, so the next one, and maybe we can stop here because our time is up. If I have been attempting Blavatsky's diagram of meditation, should I change now? No, I personally value a lot Blavatsky's diagram of meditation. What I would say is that for any meditation to really work, we need to have a certain degree of ability to concentrate our minds. So if you can follow the diagram of meditation and you can meditate steadily on unity, for example, by expansion, as she says, then you can go on there. But if you feel that you need to practice concentration, infinite expansion in time and space is not the easiest object to use as concentration. So maybe if you are a devotee of Blavatsky, concentrate on, a portrait of her or one of the masters or any other object you can find it. So I would say it depends on whether you feel you have to practice more concentration so that you can practice the diagram better. Or if you feel comfortable, then sure, you can use, the sense of expansion in time and space as your object of concentration and try to stay steadily in that sense of infinite, expansion, boundless. So it depends. All right. So I think we can stop here. If you have more questions, just write them down. We will continue to discuss these things for 4 weeks, so we can always address these questions later. So thank you, everybody, for participating, for your contributions, and I hope to see you next Monday. Have a nice week. Bye-bye.